All right, in this short demo, we're going to show you how to turn Kaggle's G-Research crypto forecasting competition into a Kubeflow pipeline using the KFP SDK. If you haven't already done so, you're going to want to have Kubeflow deployed. The easiest way to do that is to use Aricto's Kubeflow as a service. Once you have Kubeflow deployed, you want to navigate over to the Notebooks view, and let's create our first notebook. So click on the New Notebook button, and from here we're just going to name our notebook Kaggle Creds, and then we're going to go ahead and take the rest of the defaults and click the launch button. Now this first notebook that we're creating, we're going to use it in order to facilitate the creation of a pod default. That's going to allow us to store our Kaggle credentials so that we don't have to pass them in clear text when we actually run our pipeline. So let's connect up to our notebook, open up a terminal. So here we're going to want to create our Kubernetes secret using our username and password from Kaggle. If you don't have one, head on over to Kaggle, go to your account, and you'll see a create new API token. That will generate a JSON file that will have your username as well as your API key. So then go ahead and run that command, and that will create the Kubernetes secret. And once that's done, let's create a new file. And here we want to create a YAML file called Kaggle_pod. Double click on it, and once you're in it, you're going to want to cut and paste the contents that you see here. And once you have those contents there, you're going to want to go ahead and save out your YAML file. And then we're going to want to apply this YAML file. So we'll open up a terminal, and we'll want to execute the apply command there against that YAML file. And with that done, we have our Kaggle credentials stored. So let's go ahead and spin up our second notebook. Here we're just going to call it G-Research Crypto. Here we do want to make some adjustments to the configuration. First, we want to give ourselves 8 CPUs. We want to give ourselves 16 gigs of RAM. We do want to bump up the storage to 50 gigs. And here in the advanced options, we're going to want to make sure that we check the Kaggle secret box. And again, this is going to allow us to run the pipeline without having to supply our Kaggle credentials in clear text. With the notebook up and running, let's go ahead and connect to it. Once connected to it, let's open up a terminal. With the terminal open, we're going to want to git clone the Kubeflow/examples repository. And once that examples repository is pulled down, we should navigate into examples, locate the G-Research directory, get a little bit of real estate, and let's open up the KFP notebook. With the notebook open, let's go ahead and start working through it. All right, the first order of business is going to be to upgrade pip. So let's go ahead and run that cell. Next, we're going to want to install the KFP SDK. So let's go ahead and run that cell. And after the SDK has been installed, let's go ahead and restart the kernel. And with the kernel restarted, we should be able to confirm the version of the KFP SDK that we have installed. And you can see that we have version 1.8.14. Next up, let's go ahead and import the KFP components. With that completed, we're ready to move on to our component creation. The first step that we want to create is going to be the download data step. With that step created, we're ready to move on to our second step, which is going to be the load data step. So let's go ahead and run that cell. Then we move on to our third step, which is going to be the feature engineering component. So let's go ahead and run the cell that will create that component. That takes us to our next pipeline component, which is going to be the merge assets, data, and features step. So let's go ahead and run that cell. That takes us to the modeling step. So let's go ahead and run the cell that will create that pipeline component. And takes us to our final step, which is going to be the evaluation step. So let's go ahead and run the cell that will create that component. And we're ready to move on to creating the actual pipeline components using Python functions. So let's go ahead and run that cell. And let's go ahead and create our Kubeflow pipeline. Let's create the client that we're going to need, as well as supply the pipeline some arguments. And then finally, let's go ahead and run the actual pipeline. And with the pipeline launched, you see we have a hyperlink. Let's go ahead and click on Run Details. That's going to take us into the runtime execution graph. And from here, we're going to see our pipeline execute in real time. You can see that we've created a data volume. We are now in the download data step. We now then move on to the load data step. It completes, and then we move on to our next step, which is the feature engineering step. That step completes, and then we move on to our next step, which is going to be the merge assets and features pipeline step. And then we move on to our modeling step. And then we're ready to wrap things up with our final step, which is going to be the evaluation step. And with that step complete, we are ready to inspect the details of any of these steps. For example, we can look at the details around the evaluation step. You can see we have inputs and outputs, snapshots, visualizations, details, volumes, log information, pod events, as well as artifacts. So if we click on the Run Output tab, you can see we have our two metrics there. And of course, you can always look at the more complex version of the simplified graph. And that's it. You've successfully created a Kubeflow pipeline using the KFP SDK for Kaggle's G Research crypto forecasting competition.